Hello and welcome to India Speak, the Center for Policy Research's podcast series. I'm Yamini Aiyar, and you're listening to our special series on India and the pandemic. Joining me today is Maitreesh Ghatak, Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Maitreesh has been writing extensively about the inequality problem that confronts the Indian economy today. We're going to talk to Maitreesh about inequality, both specifically in the context of COVID-19, asking whether COVID-19 and our policy response to COVID-19 has exacerbated inequality or merely put a mirror to a problem that has always existed and been a part of the structure of the Indian economy. And also talk to him about what kinds of policy responses we need to consider if India is to take the inequality problem seriously and think about what are the pathways for growth that can address this challenge and ensure that post-COVID, India's economy finds its way onto a growth trajectory that is equitable and ensures prosperity for all. Maitreesh, it's an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you on our podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, and always look forward to these conversations with you online or offline.
Thanks, Maitreesh. So let's start by unpacking the context in which India experienced, or the Indian economy rather, experienced COVID and the associated economic contraction. Last year wasn't a good one for the Indian economy, as it wasn't for most economies around the world. India experienced its biggest contraction ever since the post-independence period of a 7.3% contraction in the economy. And importantly, as we've seen from data on employment, grassroots surveys on the impact of the pandemic on incomes, on consumption, there has been a significant impact of the economic contraction on the lives of the poorest. The Pew Research Service estimates that India may have had an increase in poverty by about 75 million. And in fact, funnily enough, in this same period, the number of Indian billionaires has risen from 102 to 140. So even as the Indian economy contracted, its biggest ever contraction in the post-independence period, even as nearly 75 million people, poverty increased by nearly 75 million people, the rich in India did remarkably well. And several economists have said that the recovery we experienced last year after the lockdowns opened up, after the economy opened up, was essentially a profit-led recovery. So if you are a listed company, life was good. In fact, for some, even better than it was before the pandemic. But if you were an employee, or worse, if you were found jobs in the informal sector, which is where the bulk of the Indian economy seeks work and receives work, the consequences of COVID have been severe and appear to look like that distress is going to continue. But this is not unique to the pandemic. Maitreesh, you have recently written about how deep the inequality problem is in India, one that predated the pandemic. So could you talk to us a little bit about where we were even before the pandemic hit?
Let me just begin by making the following observation, which was also partly referred to by you, that of course the pandemic has been a public health and economic disaster, and therefore whatever is happening to India, it would have been a serious situation, irrespective of where we were before, irrespective of what's happening in other countries, and so on. So it's one of those shocks, once in a century shocks. But I think this has almost dulled some people into thinking that therefore whatever is happening is due to the pandemic and we are trying our best and that's that. So before I get into the long-term trends that you're referring to, that the pandemic kind of exacerbated, as I and others are arguing. So let me just therefore set the stage by saying that one of the essays that I wrote recently looked very thoroughly in terms of several macroeconomic indicators, and not just the contraction rate, unemployment, as well as various aspects, measures of poverty, and as much as data permits us to look at these things. And India's performance has been, relatively speaking, not good at all. It has been, if you just give you one example, if you take the GDP growth rate at constant prices, as you mentioned, the contraction rate for India has been minus 7.3%. For the world as a whole, it has been minus 3.3%, right? And even if you look at a reference group of comparable low-income and emerging countries, there the contraction rate has been minus 2.2%. Okay, so therefore we should calibrate and come clean on this, that India has taken a bigger aggregate hit in terms of the economic consequence of this shock, and the public health. We are all following what is being discussed, and I will, focus my energies talking more on the economic side of things. So now coming to the point you mentioned about the wealthy doing relatively well, etc. One of my fond hopes out of this, the crisis that we are experiencing, which has been brutal and severe, is from now on, in the conceivable future, we stop talking about the growth rate whatsoever. It'll be reported like many other things that are reported, but as with, say, various reports that come out, whether it's the UN HDI type things, the World Bank publishes various indicators. I think what this crisis has severely and seriously highlighted is there is no such thing as an aggregate growth rate. It's a statistical construct, of course, you can construct it, but it almost is meaningless. As you said, that, even in terms of the aggregate growth rate, we saw what India's performance has been. But the point is, when you have a kind of situation where there's been a divergence in the economic trajectories of the vast majority of the population versus the top 10% or top 1%, whichever way you slice it, right? Then the average almost is meaningless. This is meaningless concept, and it hides and it sort of clouds more than what it reveals, right? It's the classic thing that if you have a situation where, say, the very rich landed class, say in the 19th century, are eating lavish meals and 90% of the population are barely getting a meal, we could still say that on average, the diet is not so bad, because, the lavishness of the meals of the very rich may offset the fact that on, the poverty of the meals of the very poor. So we all use summary measures. When, say, our children bring back report cards from the school, we do want to know how much they have gotten on aggregate, what is the average score. But we also are fully aware of it's the whole distribution and certain aspects of it that are really important, right? So, somebody could get a good score on average, right? But fail in mathematics or for that matter in history, and that's not going to really help, right? So I think one of my genuine hopes is, if we talk about growth, it should be growth by income or wealth classes, right? There's nothing, we are all supporters of growth. We all understand that growth is all about opportunities and expanding the pie and all of that. There's nothing, we shouldn't revert back to the old left-right debate about, if you have growth, then you have to give up on equality, or if you want too much equality, then growth will go away. But my genuine hope is, this crisis, because this academic point was well known that the growth is just an average measure and so on, but the numbers we are just seeing here, that actually the crisis has been relatively good for the rich, right? In terms of, these various indicators. So if we just say, computed, which is hard given the data limitations, of growth rates by, say, wealth percentile. What is the growth rate in income, net assets during this crisis of the top 1%, top 5%, etc.? Then the whole situation will be revealed, and we will realize that this is nearly a meaningless number to report what is happening on average. So that would be my kind of real introduction to this. And of course, I want to come back to some of the prior trends and how the crisis exacerbated it. But my kind of, I would say beginning 2 points that I want to highlight before we get into the nuances and details is, yes, India handled this crisis economically, or its outcomes, economic outcomes, have been below average. It has not, just to say that there's been a crisis, so things will, of course, be bad. That's not true. No amount of talking about V-shaped or U-shaped or Z-shaped recovery is going to sort of take away from that fact that there is a cross-sectional comparison one could make, right? And even among developing and emerging countries. And number two, that aggregate measures really conceal vastly more than they reveal, and therefore we should really take away. It's a bit like if somebody is very ill and you say, well, on average the health indicators are looking fine. That would be a meaningless statement if your doctor told you that on average you're doing fine, but of course your kidney is almost not working. What does that mean? So anyway, I would say that would be my way of kind of setting the stage here.
So, first, Maitreesh, you make this very important comparative point that when it comes to, so all economies took a hit expectedly, but the Indian economy took a far greater hit. Now, let me ask you two questions. One, we know that India went into the pandemic on the back of a slowing economy. GDP growth was lowest since 1991 in the last quarter of the financial year that predates the start of the pandemic in March 2020. So there was something going on. Is it that contributed to the extreme deceleration of the economy or contraction of the economy? Or is it that we didn't do the right things in terms of the policy choices? Because we do know, especially if you look at the US, the UK, that the nature of the fiscal stimulus was far more generous than what the Indian government chose to do. And the choices we made were, and seem to continue to make, are relying far more on monetary levers than fiscal levers to stimulate the economy. So is this contraction a consequence of past trends that were exacerbated, or did we, or did our policy choices cause this?
That's a really good way to frame the debate around a lot of economic issues that are being discussed at the moment. So let me sort of make briefly the following point. I think there are two things that are going on. In the language of econometrics, when you say that how much of this caused that, right? Clearly, there is a direct effect, and we can discuss that, right? How much of the earlier trends or earlier policies led to this kind of performance after the pandemic, right? And that's fair. But as we know also that in econometrics, there's something called the omitted variable bias, that what are the common factors that were driving things both before and after. And therefore, it's not just that the policy choices just before caused what happened later, but there is a common policy framework, common approach, common mindset that could be causing both, even if we could logically make the case that the economy before the pandemic and after the pandemic are really independent, which of course they are not. But what I'm saying, even if logically they were really different, right? The fact that there is a common mindset here that is at work, I think is also responsible for it. See, both you and I know that it's hard to, given the data we have, it's hard to pin down how much, right? So clearly both are going on. And I would not even venture to say, based on the information we have, as to which one is even bigger. So I want to be agnostic there. So unless we have some evidential basis to say it is a bit more of, say, the consequence of the earlier policies versus the common approach that governed the policy choices of the recent years and policy choices after the pandemic. So that is a hard question to answer, right? With the kind of limited data we have. But let me highlight what some of these things are. So as you rightly said, that there was a decelerating growth process, right, which kind of started in 2016, and then it has been kind of, if you look at quarterly data, it's been, was increasingly apparent, and many, including me and you, have written on this before the pandemic hit, right, that there was a genuine deceleration that was going on, and also the fact that the deceleration possibly understates the true rate of deceleration, again, because the informal sector is not quite captured in some of the national income accounting methods that are, many experts have convincingly argued. So the true decline could have been likely to have been worse. So if you look at the numbers, I have some numbers from some of the recent pieces I did. So right before the pandemic, if we look at the previous fiscal year, 2019-20, India's GDP at constant prices, the growth rate was 4%. Whereas for the world, it was 2.8%. And the reference group that I referred to of a set of emerging and developing countries, that was 3.6%. And of course, if we look back earlier, India's growth rate was higher because it was decelerating, right? So, this was the kind of cross-sectional picture before the crisis. And after that, I already told you what is going on. So even if you literally take this, right, and these 2 years, and you can do the calculation for the last few years also, the rate of deceleration or the contraction has been severe for India. So even allowing for the fact that despite the deceleration, India was growing at a relatively faster rate, marginally more so than the reference group, right, is kind of wiped out by the contraction or the way the pandemic played out, right? Now, how much? So that's sort of the kind of preface to me getting to your main questions. See, for the last 6-7 years, a lot of the debate in the Indian economy has kind of really focused on the supply versus demand side issues. And that's one of the dimensions, right? Whether it's the GST reform, whether it's demonetization, whether there are a number of things that the government is trying to do on the supply side. But then there's also this continuous discussion about if people don't have purchasing power, if all sections of all population are not connected to the engine of the whole economy. It's like, think of this as a train, that the train that is moving and maybe some structural changes is being made to make the train move faster. But if all the compartments and the carriages are not well connected, they are not gonna move properly, right? And the whole point is, without the purchasing power, right, without the income generation, they cannot be connected, right? Because they are essentially, their demand will not be an effective demand that will then register in the kind of for the rest of the economy, right? So therefore, I think there are fairly compelling evidence on agrarian distress, on which, again, there's been a fair bit of discussion, as well as the kind of real sclerosis, as well as the kind of almost drying up of the informal sector, right? These things, again, have been documented before the pandemic hit, right? So now imagine if I again take the health analogy, that there were individuals who are already weakening and emaciated before a major crisis hit, and then a major crisis hits, right? There's no doubt whatsoever that that would accentuate the hit, they accentuate the extent to which they would be negatively affected, right? It's the classic thing, right? That suppose you were already getting weak and unfit, and then there's an earthquake, right? Or whatever, something shakes you up, you're going to fall much harder because you were, if compared to if you're already fit, and then you would also be able to recover from this faster. So that's clearly going on. And therefore, in that sense, I think what you said about the legacy of the earlier policies. So this is not just the fact that there's the distribution issue, that the vast majority of the Indian population was not economically prospering, and if anything, there was a decline. I think it's the recognition of that. But there are other issues. I think that if you really think about I already mentioned the supply versus the demand issue, right? That is a factor that even if the distribution was not the issue, the fact is, recessions happen in developed countries too, right? I mean, even in economies where there are inequalities less of an issue, recessions can happen, and effective demand does play a role, which is why the US, those demand boosting policies seem to have at least tempered the how much the economy was affected by the pandemic. But as I said, that therefore this mindset, policy mindset, in which the supply side was always given the primacy, right? And that, I think, is almost like creating a very fancy vehicle, but forgetting about the fuel, right? You need to have the fuel for that vehicle to run. Otherwise, you can design a very, very fancy vehicle, but that will not happen. So the third consideration, other than the inequality and then this primacy of the supply versus the demand, is really this odd attitude towards the informal sector, sometimes almost pretending it doesn't exist. And then empirically, for example, the NSS data that was, the sort of the provisional report that was released, and then the main report was never released. We know that the national income statistics understate what is going on for the vast majority of people who work in the informal sector, what is going on with them, and NSS was one of our methods to get at them. I think this is also, it's like what you cannot see is not something you need to worry about, right? So out of sight, out of mind. So I think that is also the third factor in inequality and this supremacy, is really almost ignoring the fact that your stats are not, if you think about statistical terminology, you're not sampling well from a big chunk of the population. Whatever your policies might be, whatever your thoughts might be, you're oversampling a certain narrow segment of the population of the geographic area, and not a vast part of the country. And that should worry you, whatever your policy views. You could be a supply sider or a demand sider or whatever it is. So I would say these three factors, I think, are mindsets that affected both the pre-pandemic economic approach, and certainly after the pandemic. You have written, I have written, and others have written on the limitations of the relief package and some of the measures that were put in place, the fiscal as well as monetary measures. I think this mindset or the framework that drove the policy in the pre-pandemic period also carries over. So even if somehow we could surgically remove the direct effect of the previous, policies or the previous state of the economy and kind of start afresh for where we are, unless we change that mindset, unless the reboot in this mindset, we're going to likely to repeat the same mistake.
But, Maitreesh, here's the challenge, right? Which is that a lot of the focus of our policy making, our economic policy making, and particularly in the last 5 years, has been in some ways, while the informal economy challenge has been invisible to the mindset of policymaking, it's also been extremely visible in the sense that a lot of steps have been taken. Good, bad, ugly is perhaps for a separate discussion. But whether it is demonetization or GST, the arguments put forward were that these were pushes to policy reforms in the direction of formalizing the informal economy. So in some senses, it's not like the informal economy was ignored. It's that the attempt was to bring more of the economy through a set of so-called structural reforms, good, bad, and ugly. And the funny thing about the COVID recovery is that in some ways, the formal economy is actually doing well and generating growth and profits. So, but it's doing so at the cost of the informal economy. So, Pranjal was on our podcast a few weeks ago, and she's also written a lot about this, that, part of the profit-led recovery was also a consequence of the profit of the large companies shoring up demand that would have ordinarily gone to smaller informal enterprises, partly because the formal economy is more agile and more capable of responding to the shifting economic context that the lockdowns and COVID brought about. So she sort of calls it distress formalization, which is precarious. But I worry that our policy making architecture has spoken about formalization of the economy a lot, and is quite comfortable with butcher's knife approaches to formalization of this nature. So are we sort of locked into a policy ecosystem that is going to constantly look for growth out of the formal sector without really creating conditions for transitions from informal to formal?
That's a great question. And I think you're right that in a certain way, the informal economy was not ignored. I mean, I'm going to make clear now what is the sense in which it was ignored. But I think you've rightly asked for the clarification, and these are my thoughts. So I would say that, and I think it's consistent with what you said about Pranjul has said in an earlier podcast. So there are kind of 3 points I want to make here. The first is nothing can be done like in a kind of very brute force method, right? So as like, you cannot use steroids to somehow speed up. You think something is stunted, so you just pump in steroids, and then you say, hey, look, the child is growing, right? So therefore, we all know this, and there are many other policy experiences across the world where anything that it's like, it's the kind of, you have a hammer and you just looking for nails to hit on, and somehow then thinking that this will go away. Think about, just to give maybe another everyday analogy, think about psychological problems. We all know that there was a certain mindset that's somehow a weakness, right? That people, it's like, okay, be tough, grow up, right? That kind of stuff, right? We now know enough that, to be aware of psychological problems, and you cannot just somehow assert or rule or write down regulations to kind of saying, hey, you're all formal now, okay, and get going. So that's the nominal or the superficial versus the real question as to how you formalize, right? There's a reason the informal sector existed. Anything that exists, right, there's a reason, and there's a whole ecosystem under which it exists, and you cannot just suddenly declare formalization. It's a bit like, okay, to take an extreme analogy perhaps, it's like China in the late in the 50s realized it's as insufficiently industrialized, and therefore it was not quite at par with other Western countries as well as the Soviet Union. So they decided, okay, we're going to industrialize in 3 years. We all know how that panned out, right? So yes, eventually it did industrialize, and it's a formidable industrial power now, but it takes a certain slow and thorough process and organic way in which this can happen. You cannot just regulate an economy or do it by diktat, right? That's my point number one, right? The second point I would say is essentially in terms of how this was done, right? There were lots of things in which even if the goal one can support with that, okay, some things should be brought under the net of formal transactions, brought under the tax net, brought under certain safety net type things, as overall as weak as they might be. So even if one were to agree on the fact that some attempts at formalization, that mindset was fine, right? The way this was done in a very top-down and kind of ham-handed way, I don't have to tell you, you have written, and as at the CPR and various other policy think tanks, I'm sure this is a matter of everyday experience and case studies and evidence that you see where this ham-handed implementation. So even if one were to agree with the overall goal, my third point I think is perhaps the most substantive, and that explains what I was saying and where your clarification comes in. See, I view economies as people. I don't view economies as some external objective thing, and that is the core thing. So I view an economy as constituting of people. Of course, people need resources. We need capital, we need machinery, we need knowledge, human capital, we need training, we need natural resources, we need whole sorts of things. But at the end of the day, to almost make a, sort of textbook national income point, the whole flow and stock issue, the flow of income, the flow of consumption, everything comes from people. There is no such thing as an economy in abstract. Of course, we have to use that category for ease of communication. But whenever we say economy, it might actually be helpful to think about a whole set of, think of this whole collage of, millions of faces, right? So that we see in some of these kind of collages. And that is helpful to know. Because you can have certain rules in place and you can have a very kind of, strict regime that you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and you have to do this. But unless you create an enabling environment for people to take, agree to this, right? And their integration is kind of organic, in which they also see the benefits. It almost seems like a very strict disciplinary type of approach that, hey, you better formalize or else, right? So my point is, we did, suppose all these measures did, even if we, as I said, even if we agree with the goal of formalization, even if we agree with the implementation, which, we don't, but suppose for the sake of argument, even if we did, right? You still have to have opt into the formalization process in a in a way that people would see that as part of their, they want to do it, because we are, after all, a democracy. We are not a centrally planned economy, and you cannot almost, like you would chase away mobs or chase away sort of, animals and whatever. You cannot chase people into, hey, that's the bad part of the economy called the informal sector. We are now going to create lots of noise, and you better run into the formal sector. Otherwise, we're going to be really upset and deprive you of various administrative and create various administrative barriers. So I think that may have been the problem, that if the focus was on people, that, okay, informal is bad and formal is good, right? But how am I helping the informal sector trader or the shopkeeper or the migrant worker? How is this formalization working out for this person if we think of this person's welfare in mind, as opposed to stats and what we can report, etc. I would say these are the 3 points in which, and I'm really glad you asked that question, that sometimes these things get a bit glossed over as to, yes, this administration has been dealing with informality, and the question is how that has panned out.
Two crucial ones which are interlinked. One is that economies are about people, and ultimately you have to invest in people and unleash their potential for an economy to grow. And linked to that is that the process of growing an economy and formalizing it requires us to invest in that enabling environment, that ecosystem that allows people to become active participants in the economy and exploit their potential for growth. And in some ways, where we began this conversation, the question of inequality is very much about that. We seem to have, and your writings have highlighted this in such articulate ways, we've invested very little in people who needed investment and creating enabling environments for them to be active participants in the economy, and rather have enabled opportunity and choices for those aspects of the economy that were already in a position to make good of the fruits of growth, which is sort of why the inequality challenge is one that needs to be debated, not in the context of growth versus inequality, but in the context of mobility, the ability of people to exploit their potential and become active participants in growth. Can you talk to us a little bit about the core argument as you have constructed it, to be able to also push us into thinking differently about the framework of growth versus inequality, formality versus informality? Because I think that we need to be able to move out of those old frames to really start engaging with the realities of the economy.
So I think that I would say that there are two critical elements here, or two dimensions that are sometimes hidden, and that's why we often relapse back into the old left versus right, inequality versus growth debate. One issue is this whole thing about people are different. There's no such thing as an aggregate, right? I mean, that's only a statistical construct which may be useful in certain cases. But on average, when we say something like this is happening on average, we all want to know, right? I mean, that's useful to know that what's happening, to Delhi on average in terms of, say, health or other things. But we should very well be aware of the fact that this is hiding the multitude of differences, and we need to take a more granular view, right? So it's a bit like if somebody says that you need to land your plane and on average you have land there, right? Are you going to land your plane without realizing that on average it may be more land mass, but I could be landing into the water and I could, so you see what I'm saying? So therefore, that is kind of a key one dimension that is often forgotten, that causes this relapse into the old left versus right, inequality versus growth debate. The second dimension is the time dimension, because essentially a lot of this discussion is, yes, at any given point in time, even if, suppose, starting tomorrow, we create the most pro-poor egalitarian framework in which those coming from poor backgrounds now have excellent opportunities to get skills, get education. Suppose we create through some magic sort of switch being pressed. Suppose we did that, right? Cross-sectionally, though, inequality will not only persist for a while, inequality may always be there because there are many other factors, right, other than inequality of opportunity, which is what public policy should focus on. Many other factors that drives what causes some people to do better economically than others, right? And some of that, I think, in this left to right debate, I think the right correctly points out that, hey, even if you look at all those, say, who have a certain economic opportunity, etc., some people do work hard, some people are talented, some people get lucky. And in some sense, policy should not obsess about almost chopping off the top, because as if that is good in and of itself, right? I mean, I'm not opposed to there being, I think my writings make it very clear that various forms of taxation. But my point is, the point is not to chop off the heads of the relatively tall to bring them in line with the relatively short or stunted, right? So I think what I would like to ideally see when we look at data, when we do these discussions about what policies are good, what policies are not, I think the fact that the existing discussions have these limitations, that you're kind of taking too aggregative a view and you're constructing this hypothetical average person whose growth rate that you're focusing on. That's one limitation. And B, you're kind of taking a complete snapshot as to what is happening at the moment and not looking at what the changes are. It's a bit like, if you study any moving object, it's helpful to know where its position is, but it's also extremely important to know the trajectory or the momentum that has, because inequality may be high initially, but inequality may go down if you have a very enabling growth environment, which will kind of the dream, or at least hypothesis, I don't know, maybe dream is too poetic given his overall nature of work, but Kuznets, right? The whole Kuznets curve is, with growth initially inequality would go up and then it would kind of fall, right?
So, I mean, in some ways, that was the framework of that was what the imagination of the 1991 moment too, that we live with some inequality, but net, there will be growth for all.
Exactly right. So now to come back to how I really, this has been a framework that we have discussed earlier, and it has now shown up in various arguments and pieces that I've written, and hopefully eventually a book will be coming on this, is really then how do we connect this? One, that there's heterogeneity. There's no such thing as the overall Indian economy, right? It's a collection of individuals, and what's happening to different groups is really what we should focus on, and not focus on this hypothetical average guy, because by the nature of the averaging, this average guy is likely to be the 90th in terms of the, if we rank people by income or wealth, this average person, the person who earns the mean income, is likely to be in the very top 10% of the income distribution, right? We just, because of the nature of the inequalities here. And number two, I'm willing to live with inequality if I have an assurance that there is an enabling and equal opportunity environment where in the long run inequality will diminish, because you can have an initial situation of inequality, and there, if all the discussion is focused on just inequality, you could take policies that could be misguided, that it could essentially act like topping, focusing on kind of almost shrinking the top or shortening the top, but without really helping raise the bottom, right? Which is what a progressive outlook should be. And that's why even with all this discussion about post-liberalization, inequality has gone up significantly. Yeah. Poverty has also gone down. I think this is a debate, I think, on which, on the kind of whatever the growth side of the spectrum is correct on that, right? The point, though, is that it has not gone up significantly or substantively, right? Of course, it is better than, if you're very poor. It was far worse in 1980 than it was in 2010, for example, right? So there's no question about that. But it has not been sufficient. And if we just take poverty lines that are a bit more generous than the very, very tough ones, right? A large section of the population's condition has only marginally improved. So my proposal, and this is something we have discussed, and I really strongly believe in this, and this is kind of ideology neutral, because all we are saying is, as much as if you go, say, various households and say, on average, this household is healthy, and yet there's a very sick kid in that house, that's not helpful for formulating health policy, right? That on average, the family is fine. It's just that one kid is very, very sick, or one elderly person is very, very sick. Similarly, for the economy, we need to create a kind of database where we can track the progress of people from different income groups and wealth groups. Because to the extent they're all doing well, and whatever policies are in place, they'll tend to do well, then the growth kind of corner can deflect a lot of these criticisms as saying that, okay, how can you be opposed to the fact that somebody who's an agricultural laborer, the wage rates went sufficiently and employment opportunities went up, so this person in real terms is actually better off, right? So that would be a very credible argument. And B, I think this whole issue about mobility and both intragenerational and intergenerational mobility, look at what is happening to a person over, say, a bit longer horizon period. That suppose you start off as a laborer, but maybe in 5 years you start a small trade, right? And maybe in 15 years you have a small business, and you're just about reaching the lower middle class kind of rung. I would say that's real progress. And if that is happening, and if that is what liberalization and all these things enable, and to some degree have enabled, that's a good thing. That's what we should really be supportive of, right? As opposed to people kind of staying in their respective occupational and income classes and only doing marginally better. Earlier, you would just have, I don't know, this much rice to eat. Now you have a bit more rice to eat. And that's good. We are not, any positive change is good. But I think this kind of qualitative improvement is what we should look at, both within a generation and all the in this sort of difficult times. What are the stories that occasionally make us feel good about India or what's going on? Is when kids of, say, relatively poorer sections, they're doing well in their exams and then kind of stepping into white collar jobs and so on. All those stories, for very right reasons, I think, cutting across ideology or party lines, make all of us feel good, because there's some economic justice there, and the person starting with a handicap and then kind of, overcoming that has all the elements of the kind of, positive stories that we like to hear. So therefore, I would say that's why mobility is important. Inequality is more like a snapshot or a stock. It's equivalent to a stock. Whereas mobility is the flow. Yes, there is inequality, and India has centuries of history that has caused and the inequality is at a certain state that it is. But how is it changing?
That's so important. But to get there, we first need to fix our statistical systems, which is probably a whole other podcast for us to record at some stage soon, I hope, Maitreesh. But tell me, I think, I completely agree with you that, it's a good way of thinking about inequality and intergenerational mobility as stock and flow. But we are now confronting a possibility where mobility is not even for the lower the income deciles in India, consequent to COVID. Forget status quo. There's a large number of households that are probably moving down the poverty ladder within one generation, with possibly no immediate prospects of growth pulling them back up. Is that correct assumption on the back of thin data, because we still don't know the full effects of what's happening, or what long-term impacts the last year plus is going to have? But if you were to think about this challenge from a policy making perspective, what would be the kind of levers that we need to use? I know in the longer term, a lot of discussion and debate has been underway about a wealth tax, and you've written about this as well. But I want to take us back a little bit to the immediate context. If it is indeed a possibility that we are not just going to see static mobility, but possibly prospect of households coming back into poverty and then getting stuck across a generation, what is the kind of policy lever we need to build in the immediate and in the long term to address this?
Yeah, no, it's a very important, not just a conceptual clarification about the fact that mobility can be both upward and downward. And it's also extremely pertinent given what has been going on since the pandemic broke. And we have all been following cases of people losing their jobs, even from the formal sector, even those who would not be classified as poor by any stretch. But then they're losing their jobs, having to sell off their valuables, take their kids off of expensive schools and all of that, right? So there's clearly this pandemic has caused downward mobility but you're right that we don't have a statistically a good sense of how much, right, what percentage of those above a certain income level have been directly affected by this. At least I'm not aware of any reasonable.
I mean, all we have is CMI that says 97% of households reported a loss of income, and then you do know that the loss of income in the lowest income deciles is significantly higher than those in the topmost income deciles. But again, we don't know enough.
Exactly, and I think if you really think of this as, suppose we think of income in this different income deciles as water in different, kind of glass aquariums, right? And so I think what this is showing is that the water has been going down. So income is falling across all these sort of, water containers, right? And more so in the very, very last bottom containers, right? In the ranking. But I think both what we are discussing is it's not just those water containers have a fixed and rigid wall, because some of the water is actually causing, people to move from one container to the other. And there may be some irreversibility here, because we all, there are lots of examples of, for example, the Great Depression in the US, entire generation of folks kind of lost jobs and never quite recovered from that, right? So that's the worry. So see, it's hard to, and I think we have discussed this, and also in our writings when we wrote about labor laws, we also discussed many other things. So I think we shared the perspective that it's helpful to have a general conceptual structure as to how you deal with it. But to say anything more, you would have to get to the kind of the whole careful architecture of policy design, how, say, labor policies, market policies are connected with the social safety net policies, and with the credit policies, etc. So you cannot, you have to have a vision of what's the big picture here. How do we deal with it? But saying anything more would be not very meaningful without, getting into the sort of nitty-gritty, etc. So I would say my view has been consistently, and ever since I really started writing about this, it's not so much growth versus inequality. It's really mobility and change in the economic conditions by different income groups. That's really what matters. I would say, if off the top of my head, I would say two broad things need to be in place. One is a safety net. I mean, yes, it's like saying, yeah, blue skies are good. It's like, yes, a cup of tea is good. So, and therefore, I'm nothing saying anything that I think most writers or thinkers about the Indian economy would disagree with. But I'm just saying this is important. This is super important. This is, as important as your health policy, as important as many, infrastructure. This has to occupy. It's not some almost afterthought. Oh, okay, we should have a bit of that, because this safety net is what's going to mitigate partly the effect of the shocks of, like, the pandemic, of course, is an unprecedented and historic shock, but even smaller ones, could be economic shocks, could be weather shocks, etc., going forward, right? So that safety net is what's gonna, once we look at this income group specific economic conditions, which is, what I'm pushing or wishing for, yeah. This safety net is going to make these indicators better, because essentially that's going to provide a lower bound and also allow people to rebound, when economic conditions improve. Whereas if you fall into this kind of a lower economic class, you may not be able to climb up, because there are certain indivisibilities involved that you cannot just, go slow and go fast, seamlessly, right? So I think that is clearly one very important thing. And I think the complementarity of having that with things that create growth opportunities, and also people's ability to take advantage of those growth opportunities. And that's where we need skilled workers, both because that's going to be important for economic engine to run, but that's also exactly the vehicle to which the benefits of the growth will essentially be distributed to the people who constitute the economy. Going back to my earlier point about that the economy is just an abstract concept. In the end, it's the population, it's the people, and how it's like different parts of your body. It's like different cells in your biological system. They need to the flow of nutrients and things have to really spread all through your body, and the same with the economy.
Economy is about people, and we need to invest in people, both through safety nets, perhaps more urgently today than 2 years ago, but definitively. And we need to invest in the enabling environment to ensure that people make good of the opportunity. We need to think about inequality in the context of mobility and the opportunities that households have to rise in mobility rather than stay stuck or drop in mobility. Those are some of the big takeaways from this conversation, Maitreesh. And I think this is what ought to frame how we reimagine our economy, how we talk about economic growth after the pandemic. For if we don't, we may well end up in a far worse place than where we were when the pandemic hit. Maitreesh, thank you so much for joining us. It has, as always, been an education for me, and I know for our listeners as well. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Yamini. Always a pleasure and very stimulating to chat with you.
Thank you for listening. For more on CPR's work on COVID-19, you can follow us on our Twitter handle at CPR_India and visit our website at www.cprindia.org.